Good evening, and welcome to the first event in the 2020 Hill to Hill virtual series. Hill to Hill was created in 2016 by Kenyon Center for the Study of American Democracy in conjunction with the Washington, D.C. Regional Alumni Association as a way to connect Kenyon to the broader practice of American democracy, linking our Hill in Gambier with Capitol Hill in Washington. The event was designed to draw on the Kenyon community's deep reservoir of experience and talent in the practice of democracy in its broadest form. In 2016, about a month before the presidential election, Kenyon students and faculty climbed aboard a bus and headed down to DC for rich in-person discussions with alumni and parents for the first Hill to Hill. And today, a little over a month before the 2020 presidential election, with the Kenyon community dispersed by the pandemic, Hill to Hill brings us together virtually for a series of events that aim to model the liberal ideal of deliberative inquiry, where we engage in deep probing and civil discussion to illuminate the challenges of our time from a variety of viewpoints and perspectives in ways that both recognize difference but seek understanding. The Hill to Hill 2020 events are linked by the critical question, is the American experiment still viable? The United States stands on the brink of its most consequential election in a lifetime. A global pandemic, economic uncertainty, and widespread social and racial unrest have combined with deep partisan polarization, government dysfunction, and the dramatic erosion of democratic norms and institutions to raise substantial doubts about the viability of the American experiment. Americans across the political spectrum now question whether, in the words of the Constitution, our democracy risks losing its ability to form a more perfect union. This fall, the Center for Study of American Democracy, in conjunction with the Office of Alumni and Parent Engagement, will broadcast 6 panel discussions on the viability and resilience of the American experiment, featuring Kenyon alumni, parents, faculty, and friends who are engaged with and committed to American democracy. Every Tuesday night at 7, between now and November 3rd, we will explore critical issues that confront us as a democratic people, with a final panel after the election on Tuesday, November 10th, to take stock of where we've been. Tonight's panel, Left, Right, and Center, brings together Kenyon voices across the political spectrum to consider the challenges posed by the fall's elections. This panel will explore how negative partisanship, polarization, and lack of trust in government are shaping the political landscape and their implications for the future. Before tonight's panel begins, I'd like to thank the Offices of Alumni and Parent Engagement, Advancement and Communications, and especially Lindsay Colopy, Adam Gilson, Annie Gordon, and Kent Woodward-Ginther. I'd also like to thank the Center for Study of American Democracy, especially Andrea Leckleichner and Nancy Powers, as well as CSAD student associates Rose Fisher and Mats Onesorg. All have worked tirelessly since the summer to plan these events. I also like to thank the alumni, faculty, and parents and friends of the college whom we consulted as we put this program together. And finally, I'd like to thank the primary organizer of this series, David Rowe, Professor of Political Science and Director of the Center for Study of American Democracy. And it is my pleasure to pass the baton to Professor Rowe to introduce tonight's panelists.
Thank you, Sean, and good evening, everyone. My name is David Rowe, and I am the director of the Center for the Study of American Democracy here at Kenyon. I am delighted to welcome you to this evening's panel, Left, Right, and Center. And as Sean said, this is the first panel in a 6-panel series that explores where we are as an American democracy today and what may happen or what the future may well hold. To get a better sense of the current political landscape and the degree to which our democracy may hang in the balance, I am delighted to welcome 4 of Kenyon's alumni for a discussion of these issues. Richard Baehr, class of '69, is a co-founder with a Kenyon classmate of the conservative publication The American Thinker and AmericanThinker.com. A healthcare consultant for over 40 years, Richard began his career in political analysis in the early 1990s. Jeff Bridges, class of '03, is a Democratic member of the Colorado Senate and running for re-election in District 26, one of the most economically diverse and electorally competitive districts in the state. Prior to his time in the Senate, Jeff served in the Colorado House of Representatives and has been a fierce advocate of the transition to renewable energy to create a healthier world. Paul Brown, class of '86, is Executive Director of Special Initiatives at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy and founding director of the Civic Innovation Center at the University of Maryland. He is a former federal government relations executive and staffer for Democratic leadership positions in the Senate. Sarah Longwell, class of '02, is a longtime Republican strategist and the president and CEO of Longwell Partners, a Washington, D.C. communications firm focused on fostering cross-partisan coalitions. Before that, Sarah was a partner at the public affairs firm Berman and Company, as well as the national chair of the board of Log Cabin Republicans. Please note as well that John MacNeil, class of 1980, who is listed in the program for this evening, has had to pull out of the panel on short notice due to unexpected circumstances, but very much wishes he could be here to join in the discussion tonight. At the conclusion of our interview, and how we're going to do this is I will pose questions to the panel. We will discuss for approximately 40 to 45 minutes among ourselves while you listen in and formulate your questions. And so while we're discussing for the first part, feel free to ask questions of the panel on the chat accompanying the YouTube live stream. We will look at the chat, pull questions from it, and then pose those to the panelists in the second half of tonight's event. Please note as well that we may not take the questions in order to maintain a flow of conversation. With that being said, at this point, I would like to welcome our four panelists and welcome you to this evening's event. All right. Where I want to begin tonight for Richard, Jeff, Paul, and Sarah is actually back in 2016 and the 2016 presidential elections. I think focusing on presidential elections in American politics and American democracy is really important, in part because the president is the only officer in our democracy who is elected by a national constituency. And so it is our elections for president which really define sort of how we think about different eras in American democracy. And it's elections for president that tend to be very consequential in the scope and the nature of American democracy. And so I'd like us to go back to 2016 and in the days right after 2016 when Donald Trump unexpectedly won. And one of the most insightful analyses of the 2016 elections that I heard was actually by John Elliott, whom, as you know, was a professor, a longtime professor at Kenyon College, served for 47 years, only retired a couple of years ago. And what John said was, I thought, really insightful. He said, look, in many ways, 2016 was a perfectly ordinary election. We had an election for president, and Democrats voted for the Democratic candidate, Republicans voted for the Republican candidate, and the Republicans won. And so my question is 6 months from now, once we're on the other side of November 3rd, will we be looking back and saying, hey, 2020, it was a completely ordinary election? Or will we be thinking, no, there was something about 2020 that was fully extraordinary. Democracy, American democracy, has never been here or has not been here for a very long time. And if it is extraordinary, what do you think will make it so? And Richard, since you're at the top of the list, I'll just start with you and we'll go from there.
Well, I like John Elliott, but I disagree with him a little bit about 2016. For one thing, the Republican candidate won Wisconsin, which no Republican had won since 1984, won Michigan and Pennsylvania, states that hadn't been won by a Republican since 1988, and won by large margins in states that are always very competitive, like Ohio and Iowa. Florida was the sixth state that he picked up that Mitt Romney had lost, but that Florida always goes back and forth between the parties. So the question is, why would a Republican candidate, especially one of Trump's variety, make the breakthrough that no other Republican had in those Midwestern states? I think that requires a little more than saying it's just a conventional election. Republicans voted one way, Democrats the other. On a national level, things didn't change that much from 2012, so only about 2%. But on state level, things changed dramatically. And that, I think, reflects sort of a coastal elites and Northeast Pacific coast versus Midwest and Southern and Southwest. in terms of the orientation to the candidates and also the negativity towards individual candidates. I mean, you had the Democratic candidate for president basically describe supporters of her opponent as deplorables. I mean, that's not a way to expand your tent or your base. And just as the president now may not have done a great deal to expand his, Hillary Clinton certainly didn't open up the country to her views by making a comment like that. Now, as far as 2020, I'll try to do this as quickly as I can. I think this is kind of a unique election, mainly because the focus is so much on the current president. This is much less of a choice election, and I think that's why the Democrats are doing well so far. If the Republicans are to come back, it'll be because they make it Trump versus Biden, and right now Biden has been mostly in the basement, so that's been a difficult thing to do.
Okay, Paul, would you like to chime in?
I agree with Richard in terms of my assessment of John Elliott. He was one of my professors, and a great deal of respect for him. One thing he got right was giving me my worst grade as a political science major in a class, and I certainly deserved it. But in this case, I think he doesn't paint a complete picture. And I think in some ways, the 2016 election, as much as it was, as Richard said, two polarizing, very negative people with high negatives, it was an election that was conducted under very normal circumstances. We had economic prosperity. We were not facing a pandemic. We didn't have the world turned upside down in a lot of ways that we do now. I think in some ways we're reliving or fighting the battles of 2016, which were very much focused on process. And I think there's a lot of concern in this election about the sanctity of the ballot, access to the ballot, people being nervous about participating. At the same time, there is this huge hunger for people to participate in this election. So, and I think we also have a case where we have a president who's actively trying to sow mistrust in the electoral process. So I think John was right that we had an election result that people didn't really dispute until after the fact, when there became a concern about how there was an interference from foreign governments. But in this case, we have we have an active attempt to undermine the sanctity of this election. And I think we also, because of the process we have in place with a lot of absentee ballots, we're not going to know what happened in this election till it may be weeks afterwards. So that's, and that is causing a lot of concern and a lot of nervousness on a lot of people's part, which I think is going to make this a very different result. And it's going to be a very different timeline for a result than it was in 2016.
Okay. Yeah, let me just interject for a second and defend my colleague, John Elliott. He said in many ways. And so there are ways that John recognizes that it was not a perfectly ordinary election in 2016 either. So so I want to make sure that everyone is clear that John is one of the people I go to when I don't understand American politics. And I think that and so I don't want to completely mischaracterize him, only slightly. Jeff.
Sure. When I look at 16 and I look at 20, I think that we should look at turnout as a big piece of this conversation. In 16, it was my first election for public office as a candidate. I had a very competitive primary, and I knocked on thousands and thousands of doors and had thousands and thousands of conversations with folks in my, at that time, state house district. And in that primary, I would talk to so many folks who said, I really like Bernie, but I like Trump too. And in my mind, I would think, how is that possible? How can you possibly be pro-Bernie and pro-Trump? And what I took from this is that people were sick of a government that they thought just didn't work, and certainly didn't work for them. And they voted, I think, and obviously there's a lot of Democrats who voted for Hillary. There's a lot of Republicans who voted for Trump. I think at the end of the day, though, there were Democrats who didn't vote because Hillary was more of the same. She was a continuation of a government that was fine. But at the end of the day, people didn't feel like their needs were being addressed and that they had people that listened to them and cared about them. And so they voted for the stick of dynamite over more of the same. And I think what you've seen over the last 4 years is what the consequences of voting for a stick of dynamite are. And what we're seeing this year is in the Democratic primary here in Colorado, looking specifically just at my Senate district, their expected voter turnout, if you take all the people that had voted in previous primaries, in previous elections, about 20,000 people in my 150,000 person Senate district, 20,000 Democrats that normally vote. And this year, 30,000 voted. There were 10,000, a third of the people that voted in the Democratic primary this year had never voted in a primary ever before in their lives. And this wasn't just the presidential primary. We have separated in Colorado the presidential primary from the primary for down ballot candidates. I'm talking about the primary for down ballot candidates. There were 10,000 people that were so engaged in politics this year that have seen over the last 4 years the consequence of having people in office that don't represent their values, that have been energized and are turning out. And I think that is the story of the 16 versus the 20 election.
Okay, Sarah?
Well, I don't want to pile on Professor Elliott, but I too sort of disagree with that. I understand your caveat, but I just got to say, like, I think that, maybe on paper it looked sort of normal, but everything under the surface, led us to where we are today, which is, look, Hillary Clinton barely eked out her primary victory. Donald Trump upended the Republican Party by winning a Republican primary against a whole bunch of establishment nominees with a plurality. There's all these people there splitting up sort of the regular Republican vote, and he's over here by himself in his burn it all down lane, and he gets the nomination. And then Hillary has this, and so like the story of populism, and it's why you have a lot of Bernie Trump people, but the story of the rise of populism is a 2016 story, and you don't want to miss that by sort of papering over what the way it looks sort of normal. Other things about it that weren't normal is I think there would have been a lot of Republicans, the kind of Republicans you see today who are abandoning Trump, who might have been out on him in 2016 if the Democrats hadn't had a historically unpopular candidate that Republicans were like just in their DNA, like sheer muscle memory. They could not pull the lever for Hillary Clinton. They'd been disliking the Clintons for decades. And then the other thing that was really interesting about that election and that was different was how many people wanted a neither bucket and ended up voting third party. I mean, it's very much common wisdom now that Donald Trump eked out an inside straight in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin by a total of 77,000 votes. That's fewer than the number of people that attend a highly attended football game, NFL game, right? Third party candidates got 500,000 votes across that between Jill Stein and Gary Johnson. So there was a lot about the election that was incredibly unique. And in terms of this election, and what's important about this election, as far as I'm concerned, liberal democracy and the American experiment kind of hang in the balance. And 4 years ago, I would have never said that. I would have thought somebody saying that sounded hysterical. The thing is that Donald Trump has been telling us who he is now for a long time. I agree with Paul. He has been cozying up to dictators, people that other American presidents wouldn't even have talked to. He has talked about moving the date of the election. He's encouraged people to vote twice. He has not, he refused to agree to a peaceful transition of power. He undermines voting and the way in which people are voting in the pandemic. And so Donald Trump is a unique threat to liberal democracy, in my opinion. And I think if we don't defeat him, despite the fact that as a Republican, I may share certain policy views with the party, I think that Donald Trump's capture of the Republican Party is a threat and a danger to democracy, and he has to be defeated for the Republican Party to survive, I think, and I think for liberal democracy as we know it.
All right. Well, first off, I just want the panelists to know John is never inviting me to dinner again. Although, to be fair to John, he also, one of the things that I find very insightful is he described Donald Trump's victory as a hostile takeover at that point of the Republican Party, which I think goes along with some of what we've been hearing. And so some of what I hear you saying are there are really a couple of currents going on here. One is that the American electorate in some way is in flux, because I've heard this from you guys that, hey, and this goes all the way back to, hey, Donald Trump was winning in Democratic strongholds, to Jeff's point that there were people who felt like the political system was not listening to them. And so we've really got, at least from 2016, we've got the confluence of really two different kinds of events. One is a real sort of underlying flux in the nature of the American electorate and how many people feel like the party system really doesn't represent them, or that they don't have, sort of good input into decisions that are made that affect their lives. And then the other thing we have layered on over that is because of that discontent, we have a political candidate who became president in a sense from outside of the system and has in some ways shaken up the norms and the normal operation of American politics. I think, Jeff, you said it was a stick of dynamite. And so, and so in some ways we're dealing with those two events in 2020, not to mention, the other things that we've seen only in the last year, the pandemic, civil unrest, the economic dislocation because of the public health measures. Does that, and so, the question is, and I know, Sarah, you've already gotten to this, and so I want to get to the other people. So how big a problem do we face right now as a democracy because of the kinds of stresses that we see on our system? Large groups of people who feel like they're not represented, a president who is violating norms, plus a lot of social dislocation that would be unusual for any president. What do you think? Richard, I'll go back with you.
Okay, a couple things. First is, I think you need to separate how people view Donald Trump as a personality or his character as an individual and his policy choices. Trump's an agent provocateur and seems to know well how to get under the skin of my three co-panelists here. But in terms of what he's accomplished, it's fairly consistent with what a conservative agenda would look like in terms of judges, deregulation, tax cuts, promoting charter schools and school choice, on trade and immigration. He's a little bit off the plantation, but overall, and that again is consistent with the message he gave to those people who felt his populist urges about their communities being left behind while other parts of America benefited richly. And as far as Trump being unique, believe me, he's not going to be the last billionaire, assuming he even is a billionaire. Well, I guess we'll learn that in time. But there are plenty of other people who figure that they're normal people and they're billionaires and they can buy elections. And I mean, you have Michael Bloomberg, who's broke John Connolly's record of most money wasted per delegate won in the primaries by spending $1 billion for 60 delegates, or 16 million per delegate, who's trying to bribe felons in Florida, but only those who fit into certain racial categories if they'll vote. I mean, this violates the Constitution of the United States, forget Florida law. So, I mean, in terms of busting norms, they're busting out all over. We had Hillary Clinton telling Joe Biden, under no circumstances should you concede the election. Well, how is that any different than what Trump said? And I give credit to both Dick Durbin, who repudiated Clinton's comment, and to the Republican senators who immediately told that Trump, what he said was ridiculous too. He says a lot of things that he doesn't do because despite all of his breaking all the traditions and norms, he has obeyed court orders. He has followed the rules. As unhappy as he is when district courts issue nationwide restrictions, and he's obeyed them. He may have appealed them, but he has not, in fact, broken the law as president in terms of destroying the processes we have in the checks and balances. The House was captured by the Democrats in 2018. Was Nancy Pelosi prevented from taking the speaker's gavel? I mean, in 2016, it wasn't the Russians who kept Hillary Clinton out of campaigning in Wisconsin or campaigning in Michigan, where she only visited twice. She got outworked. That's why she lost.
Okay. Paul or Jeff or Sarah?
I mean, I don't know if somebody's going to take that. I'm happy to, which is that, like, the idea that Donald Trump hasn't broken laws I mean, is absurd. Like, the guy has dangled pardons in front of staff to tell them to break the law. I, through my organization, have worked with a number of, I mean, there's an unprecedented number of people who have come out who worked in his administration, people no less than James Mattis, who have called Donald Trump a threat to democracy. He's got staff that have come out that says that he undermined the coronavirus task force at every step. There's a new report today that the political staff was making the CDC change the data. Like, I mean, to have that kind of sort of willful blindness around what the president has done and say, no, this is business as usual. It's just temperament. It's just bluster. I mean, what is the difference between what Hillary Clinton said and what Donald Trump said? Donald Trump's the president and Hillary Clinton's not. That's one of the big differences. And so, I think that there's been a real attempt from people on the right to normalize Donald Trump, to sort of poo-poo the people who are alarmed by the things that he does, the norm breaking, the fact that there aren't guardrails there, the fact that he has just an unprecedented, I mean, John Kelly, the number of staff that are coming out and saying this guy's a crook and a criminal, the number of people who worked on his campaign, they're all in jail, all of them. Like, they paid hush money to a porn star. Like, let's not normalize this guy. He's not normal.
All right, Paul.
I'm not going to defend Trump here, but what I'm going to say is that he did not originate or begin the subversion of norms in Washington and the decline of our institutions. He greatly accelerated and became kind of the epitome of that and undermining those norms. It started back in the 90s, I think, with the Gingrich Revolution and kind of turning the way the House worked upside down, maybe some of that for the better. But we've seen in subsequent Congresses, in particular in the Senate, the decline in deliberation, the decline in oversight, the decline in collegiality. And, he stepped in 2016 and kind of blew up the whole place. And, I think that what's remarkable, though, about his 4 years is that how normal the abnormal has become in terms of the news cycle, and a scandal that would take down an ordinary president is just one more thing in a daily news cycle. And it's also, quite frankly, it's the decline in oversight, or the unwillingness of the Republican Senate to sort of step up when, if it had been any other president, there would have been, I think, criticism of the way that president operates. But this president has an incredible ability to connect directly to his base and to the base of the Republican Party. And it's just been remarkable how little Congress has done to impact that. And I think that it's a continuation of a long decline. But what I would hope that would come out of this, in particular with a candidate like Joe Biden, is that he is more of a institutional player. He has good relationships with people like Mitch McConnell, if McConnell's leader again. I think we can have some confidence that the normalcy will be returned, although I think what's happened with the Supreme Court pick in the last few weeks, or last week, is going to be the real wild card in terms of how the Senate reacts, because that was the one last thing. And in order for the Democrats to respond in the Senate, if they were to try to pack the court, you'd have to get rid of the filibuster in the Senate, and that would just make the Senate into another House of Representatives. So that's the one wild card.
Okay, Jeff, do you have anything else to add to this?
Sure. So as we learned at Kenyon in our poli-sci classes, one of the most powerful tools at the president's disposal is the bully pulpit. And so folks can point to how the president has responded to particular legal demands, all of that. One of the most unprecedented parts of this presidency, though, is how he has used the bully pulpit. And I think to minimize the statements is to miss what has actually been fundamentally changing here in America over the last 4 years. When you have a president who looks at white supremacists waving Nazi flags and protesters against them and says there are good people on both sides. And that is so far beyond the norms of any president in recent memory. I mean, I thought that was one thing we as Americans could agree on. Anyone who's waving a Nazi flag is a bad guy. If you think about every president in my lifetime, certainly every president that I think we studied at Kenyon, I think they all had a sense that they were president of the United States. If you look at the letter that George Bush Sr. wrote to Bill Clinton when he lost after 4 years and there was a peaceful transition of power. That letter said, "You are now president for me as well. You're president for all of us, and I wish you the best." And when Trump was elected, I absolutely wanted him to succeed because success for the president means success for the United States. But he has over and over made it clear that he is only the president for the people who voted for him. Whether that's how funds have been distributed across the country, whether that's in how he speaks about Democrats, as we were talking about this earlier, Sarah and I, the way he owns the libs, right? I can't conceive of a previous president in my lifetime being that overtly partisan as president. And I think that is one of the biggest norms that has been broken in this presidency, and frankly, one of the biggest dangers that we face in this country. The president can't just be the president for the people that voted for him or her. The president has to be president for everyone.
David, could I make a comment?
Yes, go ahead.
First of all, I agree with a lot of what Paul said, that there is a long process here in terms of breaking norms. A couple of things I do have to respond to. One of them is the comment that was just offered by Jeff about what happened in Charlottesville. If you go back and actually read through the tape rather than how the New York Times describes it, the president made very clear his absolute denunciation of Nazis, Klan, anyone carrying torches before he switched to another topic and said there were people who were there on both sides, some who wanted to protect statues, some who wanted to get rid of statues. And there was a clear separation of the two parts of the speech. So to repeat that is basically repeating something that is fake news. It's false. It didn't happen. He didn't say it. The second thing I'd say is, as far as your acceptance, which I like that. I like what you just said about you accept that someone's elected and they're your president. That's how I view about anyone being elected, whether it's my congressman, my senator, my president. The very night Trump was elected, people took to the streets all over America with signs saying, "Not my president." Within the FBI, there were a group of people who had worked to sabotage his campaign, sabotage the transition period, and then further to sabotage his once he took office after January 20th. That, if I could just finish now, and you can respond, say whatever you want, but to believe that somehow Democrats accepted the result. I mean, you had TV ads running during that period between election day and when the Electoral College voted, asking for electors to be faithless. And in that case, it would have taken 37 electors to be faithless. It's not an election like 2000. Trump had 306 Electoral College votes. Is that really an acceptance of the president who's won an election? Are those norms to be calling for electors to be faithless in large scale? I don't think so.
Donald Trump is currently telling Republican legislators, he's got his lawyers already talking to them about being faithless electors. I mean,
and I guess my question in return is, does any of the actions of partisans on the ground justify a president declaring that president is only there to represent the people that voted for him or her? I mean, and you can point fingers all you want, but at the end of the day, he's the president of the United States, right? I mean, and people on the streets are like, they have cardboard with like Sharpie. You've got to hold a different standard for these two groups of people. For one, the president, and one on the other side, the protester. And to say that because protesters had signs, the president is now justified in ignoring more than half of the population is one of the problems we're facing right now.
All right, and before we go too deep down the rabbit hole, and I know that one of the great things about discussing American politics right now, at least if you're a political junkie, is you can do it all night long. But there are a couple of points I think that are really interesting to pull out of the discussion. One is that norm breaking isn't, as I say, it doesn't reside in the person. There's something about American politics that is leading politicians on both sides to break norms. And so we can, sort of, when we walk back the clock, we can see other politicians on other sides breaking norms. And partly that's the nature of the game. Anytime you have a rule, there are always benefits to breaking it, right? And so norms are nothing more than rules. And so it's not surprising that we're going to see that. But I think what we're seeing is that suddenly a lot of that back and forth about this norm and that norm are now touching on some fundamental norms. And about, sort of, the nature of democratic legitimacy that any president would carry into office. And I think when we say, hey, what's extraordinary about this election is that we're seeing the culmination of that whoever is elected in November, I think, is going to have a hard time if the election is close, really being seen as legitimate by the other side. And that's one of the things that I think is both extraordinary and worrisome, along with what we can call the delegitimization of normal democratic processes, elections, peaceful transfer of power. That is also, I think, extraordinary and worrying, and one of the reasons why we are here tonight. I want to, shift basis a little bit. It's fine. I would be willing to talk about Trump all night long, in part because I think every presidential election where the president is running for re-election is by nature a referendum on that president, right? That's just part of the nature of the game. But what I'd like to do is shift a little bit, because one of the things that is making this all so unstable is we have, I think, a shifting electorate, which is sort of funny, because at the one hand, you can look at American politics and say, hey, it's paralyzed. Congress is dysfunctional. On the other hand, where we started this conversation tonight was saying, hey, there are these groups out there that don't feel represented in the parties. And when Richard said, look, Donald Trump has pursued a conservative agenda, it's not clear to me that that conservative agenda necessarily meets a lot of the interests of people who voted for it. And so how is the American politics frozen? Is it shifting? What's going on inside the polity, so we have a better sense of the landscape of what voters want and how politicians are competing over them? Sarah, can I start with you on this?
Yeah, I've got a few thoughts. So one of the things that, so I do a lot of focus groups with, after the 2016 election, I really wanted to try to understand what was going on with the Republican Party, my party. And so I started doing focus groups with Trump voters. One of the things that became really clear is that people no longer define themselves as much about what they're for as what they're against. And so there's this kind of deep sort of, you call it negative polarization, negative polarity, but the idea of a Republican Party that stands for the things that I felt like it stood for when I came to it, limited government, a free market, moral leadership in the world, that's not how a lot of voters identify. What they say is, I don't like these socialist Democrats. I mean, if I hear it once, I hear it 1,000 times. The voters say to me in the focus groups, I didn't vote for Hillary Clinton. I voted against Donald Trump. And in this election, there's a lot of conversation right now about enthusiasm, right? And they say, well, Donald Trump's people are more enthusiastic to vote for him, and Joe Biden doesn't have that same enthusiasm. But of course, actually, there's tremendous enthusiasm for those people to vote against Donald Trump. And so something that I feel like our politics is losing is that sense of aspiration, that sense of understanding what they're for, and creating much more both an enmity that comes from the kind of fear and anger that with social media, we've been able now to sort of pinpoint right at people, so that people are so hyper polarized and treat each other. This idea of politics as an intramural sport is sort of being lost. And we aren't looking at each other as political parties as much as people with competing sets of ideas, but competing for power. And that leads us to things like constitutional hardball and things where the Republicans, despite saying things last time like, well, we're not going to push a Supreme Court justice through because, the will of the people, we need to hear from them. And this time they're like, yeah, no. Raw political power, we're pushing this through. And that breaks. And look, you can say, well, the Democrats did this, and then they'll say the Republicans did that. And we can go back to Bork, and it becomes a Hatfield and McCoy, Montagues and Capulets, I don't know who started it type thing. But the fact is, it is a race to the bottom for our democracy. And somebody's going to have to be the bigger person here. And I do hope that Joe Biden has kind of an old school sense of institutions that would allow him to be a person suited for this moment when America seems poised to blow everything up.
If I can just interject here just for a second, Sarah, there's something about and this is something I've been thinking about. Moderator shouldn't interject, but here we go. That I've been thinking about, because we often like to think about breaking of norms backwards, right? That well, we did it because we saw it and therefore we're responding to what someone else did. And so, you know, it's a very natural way of thinking about things. And it's also in some ways a very deceptive way of thinking about things, because it does two things. One is it disguises agency, because now suddenly your decisions about what you're doing about the future, right? I am breaking this norm, not because it was broken in the past, but actually because I have a political interest about that breaking this norm will produce. So it disguises the agency of, you know, sort of the future-oriented nature of your actions. And it also shifts our focus to the past rather than on what are we doing in the present today to affect the future that we might enjoy tomorrow. And I think that kind of shift, which you've implied there, is actually really important. Paul, can I bring you in on the shifting nature of the electorate?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just met Jeff tonight, but I think Jeff, I don't want to say Jeff's a unicorn, but he's in a very increasingly small sort of cohort of people who are in marginally red or blue, purple districts. You know, the battleground that we're fighting over now, we've become so self-sorted. The suburbs increasingly becoming more Democratic. There are no urban Republicans. When I worked in the Senate, I worked for Senator Tom Daschle from South Dakota. At the time, there were 4 Democratic senators from the 2 Dakotas. Now there are none. And I'm concerned that will be a lasting legacy, is that we are becoming increasingly sorting out by geography and polarized by geography. And as part of that, I think there's a lack of empathy and understanding about where the other side is coming from, because if there are no shared experiences, there's really, you get that enmity that Sarah was talking about. And so, you know, there's some unique phenomenon in this presidential race, and that Joe Biden from Scranton, Pennsylvania probably can't win Scranton, Pennsylvania. Donald Trump from Manhattan won't come anywhere near what he needs to winning in Manhattan. And our politics have been scrambled to that degree. You know, the fact that union voters are more likely than to vote for Trump probably than any other Republican in recent history, if not all of political history in this country. We have seen that realignment. That's, I think, a little bit more unusual. The big shift, though, is, I think, along these geographic lines, and that causes real problems when you can't compromise and find a coalition to govern. And I look back at the New Deal, where that was a lot of the traditional Democratic coalition now, but it's minus, right now it's minus the working class white voters that we had in the New Deal. So we have realigned. I think Sarah might have mentioned this before, you know, that moderate, educated, suburban Republicans are moving increasingly Democratic. I don't know if there's enough on the Republican side to draw from the Democratic side in terms of working class voters to make the Republican Party a majority party anytime soon. I think the numbers are on the side of the Democrats, which is one reason this is a very challenging election for Republicans. If there is, you know, if numbers hold as they are now, there may be another one of these reassessments that we saw a few years ago when the Republicans were trying to look back and say, how do we do better? That never really took, how do we broaden our appeal? And that didn't really take off. And then that was sort of, that phenomenon was kind of set aside because of Donald Trump. I think we'll see another assessment like that if the current trends are holding true.
Okay. Well, it's interesting in that, you know, sort of the idea that we're becoming 2 separate countries, right? That we're sorting in different ways, and that is partly contributing to the problems that we see. Another way of cutting this is that problem really a problem of how we're sorting ourselves, or is it also maybe a problem of our electoral institutions? Right? We have, you know, to go back earlier in the conversation, I mean, one of the reasons why people were arguing for faithful faithless electors, excuse me, in 2016 was because Clinton won the popular vote and Trump won the electoral college. And so we have a political system that is really designed for a national election for presidents not to compete nationally, but to compete state by state. And as we have, different patterns of migration, different, sort of the economies moving productive activities to different locations, we get, locations of certain kinds of things on the coasts, the emptying out of the industrial heartland. Is the structure of our electoral institutions, the state-based nature of them, the electoral college for the president, is that part of the problem? What do you think?
Dave, you want me to take a shot? Or?
Yeah, Rich, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's a thoughtful comment. And I also think that Paul made some interesting comments. States have a choice on their electoral college. They can be like Maine or Nebraska and allocate one elector to each congressional district. In Maine, one of the 2 electoral districts is fiercely competitive, the same with one of the 3 electoral votes that is competed for in Nebraska, the one around Omaha. States don't need congressional action to do that. If you want to have more states competitive, that would be an easy thing to do. But California would just as soon deliver 55 votes for the Democrats rather than 48. So they'll never do it. So the problem is everybody has to be able to take that risk and willing to take that risk to move in that direction. As far as a general comment about how American politics is changing, I'm a Republican, but right now I don't think Republican prospects long-term are very good unless they compete in a much more effective fashion for the votes of groups from which they historically have not drawn very much support: Blacks, Asians, and Hispanics. There are differences from election to election, sometimes within particular subgroups, where you see changes. And certainly the Republican convention this year, rather than having the leading political figures, had lots of regular people talking about why they supported the ticket or why they liked Trump or for whatever reason. But the Republicans, given the demographic split in the country, there's large growth among Hispanics and Asians. Blacks are a fairly constant percentage of the population. White population as a percentage is declining. In 1988, whites were about 85% of all the voters in the presidential election. This year, it'll be between 65 and 70%. And among whites themselves, as a couple people have pointed out, there are big shifts going on within certain communities, particularly in suburban areas and particularly among suburban women. Second factor, people are moving. I live in Chicago. There aren't a lot of full trucks moving into Chicago these days, but there are a lot of full trucks moving the other direction. And that's occurring in Michigan, it's occurring in New York and New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and they're going to the same state. They're going to Texas and Tennessee, Florida, the Carolinas, and Georgia. Those are the 6 states that people from the Midwest and the East Coast are moving. They live in California too, and they're going to Arizona. Why is Arizona so much more of a swing state now than it used to be? Because the people who move bring their political and social values with them. So the country is changing, and for Republicans to win in the future, they are required to be competitive in more than the groups in which they're competitive. And for all the criticisms of Trump, continuing to nominate people like Romney, who will go down to defeat with dignity, is not necessarily the way to future success of the party. Trump did something that maybe someone with more dignity will be able to capitalize on and realize that there are different ways to talk to voters who have been historically not part of the party.
Okay, Richard, you've raised actually 2 important points that I think I want to get to, but I want to make sure we get the audience in, and I'm going to try and meld some of their questions in with this discussion before we fully go over to them. One point is, and this is coming both from comments that are emerging on the live stream and also some of the questions I think that the panel generically should grapple with. One is that as I look at this election, or if I think back in American history, some of the most powerful presidential elections have been defined by sort of a message of optimism. And so you could think Ronald Reagan, it's morning again in America, or even Barack Obama, change you can believe in. There was a sense that there was this positive future to be grasped. And one of the places where we seem to be now is it's really an election about fear, fear of the other side gaining power. And that gets to the negative partisanship, that gets to the lack of social trust. And so a question for you guys is, are there ways and is there the political incentive to really start trying to rebuild trust across these divides? What do you think? Jeff, I'll start with you.
Thanks. Sure, you don't want to start with Sarah? I think you make an excellent point, but I think it is deeper, I think, than we don't want the other side to get more power. And I think it goes back to something I said early on, which is that people didn't feel like government was working for them, and so they voted for a stick of dynamite. I really think that's a big piece of why Trump won. I think it's a big part of why Bernie did so well in the primaries. Hillary's promise was, I'm going to make government work a little bit better for you and your family. And I actually think that part of this came from Obama's promise, change you can believe in, right? And I think a lot of people voted for Obama and then thought their job was done and he was going to deliver it. And we need people engaged and involved to make that change happen. And for all of the wonderful things Obama accomplished, which are plenty, which we're going to hear all about, I'm sure, in tonight's debate, I think people felt left behind. And when people feel left behind and disconnected, I think that is one of the greatest dangers that we face right now in American government. I think that the legitimacy of our system of government depends on people feeling like they are the ones that are responsible, that ultimately power derives from the people. And right now, I think they feel powerless and disconnected. It's part of why I, as a legislator, love the campaign side, at least as much, if not more, than the legislating side. We do really good things for a lot of people when we're legislating, but on campaigns, that's where the money's spent. That's where the conversations happen. That is when we shape what it is that people think of and feel about politics. Certainly on my level, the people that come and visit me in the legislature are a very particular kind of folks that have a very particular agenda for a very particular bill. It's not the folks whose doors I knock during non-COVID times or who I call up on the phone during these times. And so this is where we can change that conversation. And so I do everything I can in my campaigns to let people know that, at least in Colorado, 90% of the bills that we passed this last session had bipartisan support. Every bill I've ever passed personally has had bipartisan support. The dysfunction you see in Washington is not what politics has to be like. There are alternatives and there are ways to live that we are exemplifying here in Colorado. Some of my best friends in the legislature are Republicans. Some of the people I like the least are Democrats. And I think that's how it should be. And that is, we attempt to model it here in Colorado. I wish that it was more like that in Washington. I think that for historic reasons, Paul mentioned the Gingrich era, and it used to be that legislators lived in Washington, that their members of Congress lived in Washington. Their kids played on softball teams together and kid pitch baseball, and they knew each other as human beings. And when you know people as human beings, it's a lot tougher to be as nasty and partisan and political as I think we see in Washington right now. And so I think that is one of the things that has fallen away, that the recognizing other people as humans, and that nastiness is translated into people on the ground feeling alienated and left behind because all they do in Washington is fight for power. And I think we need to change the terms of the argument if we're going to win back the trust of the people here in America.
Hey,
right.
I was just going to pick up on something.
Okay, Paul, go ahead.
I think that when we talked about Obama, I think there really was something there, that there was so much hope with Obama, and it wasn't anything particularly tangible. It was something very almost spiritual. And that was a very difficult thing to maintain and to govern as. And so expectations were super high. I don't think you have those expectations with Joe Biden. I think you have already kind of a compromise that's been built into this, and say that we need this guy because he's going to, it's either that or 4 more years of Donald Trump. So I think he comes in and I don't think he has a legislative mandate that he'll be judged by. I think it's going to be relationships and the tone he sets. And I think he has the ability to do that because he has the personal relationships on Capitol Hill. I'm optimistic about that part of his, and he knows, unlike someone like Jimmy Carter, who came in as an outsider, or Bill Clinton, who came in as an outsider, he's been there since 1972. And he's gotten, in my mind, he's gotten better and he's gotten more experienced and he's gotten wiser, I think, about the way Washington works. I think from a Democratic perspective, there's optimism there. It's going to be very difficult to govern in the next 4 years because we don't have any money, for one thing. So I think expectations are working to Joe Biden's advantage. And that, in a way, that's what hurt Obama and why the Democrats lost the Congress in 2010, because expectations were so high. And in the view of a lot of Democratic voters from 2008, the Democrats didn't meet those expectations.
Okay, Sarah, you're explicitly engaged in trying to rebuild a center. So how do you see this problem? And, in a way, Jeff has sort of dissed you a little bit because, he's out there doing it in Colorado and you're in, Washington, D.C.
We do everything better in Colorado. It's just the nature of it.
Everybody
if only we had Jeff Bridges. That is the solution.
It's going to be my campaign slogan from now on. If only we had Jeff Bridges.
Yeah. Words I never thought I would say in college. Yeah, look, there's rebuilding the center is sort of a different thing. I will say one of the reasons I think it's really important I think it's not enough for Joe Biden to win. Not just because of the way that Donald Trump is already sowing distrust in the legitimacy of the election, is trying to find ways not to count people's ballots and all those reasons. But the thing about this election and why it's so important is Joe Biden has to thoroughly repudiate Trump and Trumpism. The voters have to thoroughly repudiate Trump and Trumpism. There needs to be a demonstration that this is not who we are. This is not who we want to be. And for the Republican Party to understand, voting is how people say to a party, we don't like what you've been doing. And it creates, and I thought Richard made a lot of important points about the demographics and the way that they're working more and more against Republicans. You cannot build a majority, a governing coalition, a winning political coalition without women, without college educated voters. I mean, the idea of there's a lot of ethnic groups that the Republican Party historically hasn't made inroads in, that's true. But Donald Trump is hemorrhaging women. I mean, it's going to be, I think, very sweet justice that women, it looks like, are going to repudiate Trump by such outrageous margins, just a chasm in gender, that looks to be what's really gonna help put Joe Biden over the line. But the point is that you have to create an incentive for the Republican Party to change. And to do that, they have to want political power again and to see their only path back to political power as being different than who they've been. My worst outcome is actually what Richard talked about, which is that somebody decides, hey, Trump was onto something there. This nationalist populist thing, let's do more of that just without the gross edges of Trump. That to me is a really bad outcome. A better outcome is a Republican Party that would reflect, that would have young suburban voters who are walking away from it in droves, but who normally, it used to be that you got married, had a family, and you went from voting Democrat to shifting Republican. That's why the suburbs were so good for Republicans. That is completely changing because no one wants to be part of this party. And so I think that what has to happen is a total blowout and Republicans go out into the wilderness for a while, think about what they've done, and revisit what the future of the party is going to look like. It's a much longer conversation what that would be, but I'll just say, just very briefly, it might be something that says, before we repeal a healthcare plan, we have a plan for what that might look like. We don't say that we're just against that climate change doesn't exist. We say, here's a free market solution for climate change. It's about having some affirmative policies. The party that the reason I joined the Republican Party is I thought it was the smart party. I thought it was the party of ideas. Today, it is the party of no nothings, of no ideas, and just no. That's it. We're just the party of no.
All right, I'm gonna let Richard in here for a second, but just before I do, I just want to say something that I think is really important, and that is I think that one of the reasons we vote for parties for two reasons, and And sometimes we conflate them. Part of it is we vote based on values, right? What values do people represent? And sometimes it's based on policy. What policies, serve me. And I think sometimes it's important to pull those apart because, it may well be that someone, represents your values, but doesn't, pursue your policies, or vice versa, represents your policies, but really doesn't share your values. And those two things, should be conjoined. But Richard, you wanted to reply.
Sarah made the comment that Trump's hemorrhaging women, and as a result, Republicans are going to go down to defeat this year. Republicans have won the popular vote once of the last 7 elections. They weren't hemorrhaging women when Romney ran or when McCain ran, and they still didn't win the election. So there's something a lot bigger than just Trump's impact on women as far as the problem the Republicans have had. And when you make a comment that, well, it's a bad thing to respect the views of the people, populism's a terrible idea if it has someone who's got a little more dignity, well, just keep ignoring 2/3 of the country because you're comfortable in DC as a lobbyist, and ignore the people who actually vote and have to make a living and have to show up every day. I mean, as I said, Trump was onto something, and I think Jeff has mentioned it as well, which is why there was both this strange overlap with Sanders supporters, some of whom voted for Trump. And some of Trump supporters probably would have voted for Sanders if he'd been the nominee. There is a discontent out there, and you can ignore it, and you can blame everything in the world that's rotten on Donald Trump, and there's plenty of blame he's susceptible to that's legitimate. I'm hardly a Trump defender from A to Z, but this sort of derangement syndrome that everything that's wrong in the world, everything that's wrong in the country, everything that's wrong with the Republican Party is attributable to one individual, that's nuts.
I'm not a lobbyist, for the record, but also, leadership matters a great deal. And I think in terms of what the country looks like going forward, I think one of the things is that you can appeal to people's worst instincts, or you could appeal to their best. And I think that somebody like Ronald Reagan tried to appeal to people's best instincts in his rhetoric and in his behavior, how he comported himself. Donald Trump specifically, it's not that history started with Donald Trump. It's not that polarization started with Donald Trump. In many ways, he's as much a symptom as he is a cause. But his leadership, or lack thereof, the extent to which he is willing to divide us along racial lines for his own political purposes, the extent to which he has no respect for democracy, our allies abroad, what it is that we've built here in terms of American democracy. I think that having a leader of the party that is trying to affirmatively bring people together is really matters. And what Donald Trump's doing to the country really matters.
All right, Jeff, I know you wanted to come in.
I want to jump in on I think a point you made that is sort of separate from the conversation we've just been having, but I think is a really interesting and important point to keep in mind, which you said that voters are based on values, and sometimes those values manifest as issues, and sometimes people vote against the issues that seem to benefit them because they feel a shared identity in the values. And I just want to agree with you completely that as I talk to voters and as I try and win their support and earn their votes, I think issues are shorthand for values. I think rarely does someone, and there are certainly exceptions, there are people who are completely devoted to a particular issue perspective, and that is what they vote on. But I think for most people, the issue perspectives you hold reflect your more fundamental values. And if you communicate with people based on values, you are in many ways getting right to the heart of what it is that they care most about and what it is that they're voting on, right? We've heard this like, oh, I feel like I could sit down and have a beer with that person, and that's why I voted for them. What that shows is that they're voting, that is someone who cares about being able to have a relationship with someone they trust to have their interest at heart. And so I think when you talk about why do people vote for various different candidates, I think values is really what we have to put at the front there. And so, you can talk directly about them in Colorado: opportunity, independence, responsibility, right? Those are key frontier Western values. But you then slot issues under those. I think issues always speak to values, rarely the other way.
Okay, all right. Right now, I'd like just to, there are a couple of comments that are sort of threads that are emerging on the in the chat that none of us can see. One of them is, and here's how I'd like to frame it. It seems to me you've got to create, if we are going to recreate either a center in American politics or what we could call healthy competition among Republican and Democratic, the Republican and Democratic, conservative, liberal parties, what we have to do is we have to make it in the incentive of politicians to compete for votes and go out and talk to people, not just capture people via gerrymandering and other mechanisms. One question that is emerging is what about the Electoral College? Because we touched on it a little bit before, but is it an idea or an institution whose time has come and passed? Is it part of the problem that we face? And what would be, maybe if you would think about it, with the consequences of lifting it? Would it mean that the rural America just no longer gets heard because so few people live here relative to the coasts? Paul?
Yeah, I think it's 4 years ago, I wouldn't have said so. And I think that's part of, in some ways, getting back to John Elliott's quote, why it seemed to be a normal election is because the Democrats accepted losing the presidency again with 3 million, a plurality of 3 million votes plus. I think in some ways, this is a moment where we need something more than just look at the Electoral College. It's going to be a real look at how the Senate is set up. I think that's really kind of the core of it, where there's just a disproportionate representation of rural states with little population that have a basic, 40% of the power in Washington and the Senate that's represented by small states. And I think that's what's happened in the Supreme Court battle. We're increasingly seeing the majority of people being represented by the minority in Congress. And that is a very difficult thing to sustain. And I think that's part of how Trump won, was putting together an effective minority coalition, and Democrats didn't turn out for the candidate in 2016. I think that's not going to happen in this election. Nobody knows for sure, but the Senate will continue to be an issue. I mean, I worked there for 10 years. There's a lot of value to a place that can slow down, deliberate, put the check on the passions and just the whims of the House of Representatives, and can be a check to the executive. But it's not a democratic place at this point, where, in particular, when you've gotten rid of the supermajority threshold, and that may be even in danger with the legislative filibuster. So I think that having to look at the Electoral College and how the Senate is apportioned, it's going to be a very, very difficult thing to do that in this climate. So I think we need to, in the long run, have that conversation. I don't think it's possible in the near term.
Okay, Richard, I know you wanted to come in on this.
Yeah, a couple things. First of all, if you take the 10 largest states in the United States, 20 senators, half of them now are Democrats, half of them now are Republican. Take the 10 smallest states in the country, 20 senators, 10 of them are Democrats, 10 of them are Republican. Check out the Senate profile of Vermont, Rhode Island, Delaware, New Hampshire, and Maine. 9 of those 10 are Democrats right now. Those are all small states. None of them has more than 4 electoral college votes or 2 House members. So the idea that there's this massive maldistribution of power because of small states versus large states, I don't buy it. The second is, there's got to be some value, and I think Paul, talked about historically until the last couple of years, and now he's changing his mind. But there's a reason why the founders looked to checks and balances. They looked to preventing pure majoritarianism. They believed in this consensus building is required. They believed that there should be checks on power so that you don't simply toss out, because of a new popular wave, everything that you've done before. And that's what, if you want 2 houses of representatives, that's a non-functional body. Go ahead, be my guest. I think there's a value. And one of the reasons why, you talk about fear before. Yeah, I have a fear of packing a Supreme Court, of adding Guam, Samoa, Puerto Rico, and the District of Columbia as states, so you get 8 new senators. I don't think those are particularly good ideas. Now, you can talk all you want about how it's hypocrisy, what McConnell is doing, and versus what what he did in 2016. And there's a lot of logic to that. You can make a good case. I think Merrick Garland would have been a fine Supreme Court justice. In fact, I think Obama picked someone who's more of a moderate. He could have picked someone on the left. He didn't. He understood that this was Scalia's seat. So Merrick Garland got screwed. That's the facts of life. But right now, if you had the exact reversal of the situation and Chuck Schumer were majority leader and there's a Democratic president and you had 3 months to go, do you think they would be stuffing a Supreme Court justice down? And at least I give credit to Trump. He picked a highly qualified woman Noah Feldman, who is as far to the left as you might think O'Connor is, Barrett maybe to the right. And he just wrote a letter saying she would be an excellent Supreme Court justice. She has the temperament, she's smart. And she may get lost too by Garland because of what's going on, assuming this thing gets delayed and goes past the election and a couple senators bail out. We'll see. But you want the most qualified people on. I give Trump credit. He appointed 3 good justices.
Okay, Sarah, you have a comment? I noticed you were smiling at parts of this.
Well, I do think that it is something when one laments the fictional norm busting of the other side. The Democrats have not eliminated the filibuster. They have not packed the court. It would be very difficult for them to do so because they have a bunch of moderate Democratic senators like Joe Manchin and other people, Kristen Sinema, who would never go for those things. And so there is this attempt to justify a lot of the norm breaking that Trump does by suggesting that the other side is fictionally going to be worse. I definitely promise you they would definitely be worse, when there's not really evidence for that. But we do have all the evidence in front of us about Trump's norm breaking and the idea that like the Democrats would definitely jam somebody through. If you can, hey, listen, if you can justify, it's not just hypocrisy, it's lying. Mitch McConnell is lying to the American people. He created a fake rationale. Pete said in 2016, it's constitutional. We got the votes. We don't have to see them. End of story. That's one thing. That's not what he did. They all went out. Lindsey Graham said, I'm on the record. Okay. Show me the tape. Hold me to it. Here's the thing. If words don't matter anymore, if promises don't matter anymore, if being decent and good don't matter anymore, then that is why our democracy is going threadbare, because we don't value things that are essential. Tocqueville said, America is great because it is good. Our goodness is flagging, and Donald Trump is pouring poison all over it, accelerant all over it. And he's an arsonist pretending to be a fireman. So anyway, that's my comment.
All right, Jeff?
Yeah, I want to agree with Sarah here. Using this hypothetical Democratic response as justification for overturning a norm that they set 4 years ago is ludicrous. I think number one, we're not organized enough to do anything like that successfully. Have you looked at the Democratic leadership in Washington lately? So like, if we couldn't get Merrick Garland through, you really think we're going to be able to pack the court? Like, it's absurd. I'd say, secondly, on back to the original topic of national popular vote of the Electoral College, I believe I'm the only person on this panel that has actually voted on this. The Constitution invests the legislature with the decision on how electoral votes are awarded. And the state of Colorado has entered into a compact with other states to award their electoral votes to whoever it is that wins the national popular vote. That is on the ballot this year. We'll see if the people of Colorado agree. But that is a movement that is occurring across the country right now. And I think Paul's point, which Richard agreed with, that across the country right now, we have divisions along urban and rural lines far more than we have divisions along state lines. When the country was founded, there were significant differences that resided in those state boundaries, and people didn't move very much between states. Half the people in Colorado right now were born in a different state. It's just it is a different kind of situation that we face right now. And I think that when we passed an amendment to the Constitution calling for the direct election of United States senators, I think that was the right move too. Historically speaking, if you're on the side of greater democracy, you're generally on the right side of history. And so I think looking at all of the facts on the ground, it is the case. And frankly, this is being pushed by a lot of Republicans. There are a lot of the big funders behind this. And I think their fear is that if Texas flips, then Democrats win the presidency every single time. And so I think having these discussions on a broader scale, when was the last time a president campaigned in Birmingham, Alabama, when it wasn't a primary? If we can engage voters across the country in who it is that they elect for president, I think that is a better outcome for all of us.
Yeah, Paul?
Yeah, I think one of the positive results of just the last 6 or 7 months is, in some ways, when we talked about the sorting out earlier, I think if we can restore small towns and get in such a concentration of wealth in our big cities, which is not good for our democracy, and quite frankly, part of a real hole in the Democratic coalition is in rural America, and the ability to get back and to have a message, but also to have people in more vibrant communities in small town America. To me, I think that we have to have a sort of restoration of that balance, where so many small towns in rural America have emptied out over the last 50, 60 years. If you get a restoration of that and get small cities, small towns, places where people may be of different political parties, but they know each other, they have conversations. We've lost so many institutions in this country where people from different backgrounds can get together and have difficult conversations, because we've sorted ourselves out, and social media has made it even worse. So if we get people leaving cities and moving to places and reinvesting in rural America, I think that's good for our democracy. I don't want to see cities empty out. I just think we need to see a greater, less concentration of wealth in the urban areas, like in San Francisco, Boston, New York, Washington, which make it difficult for people to afford to live, and get back out into small town America and rebuild. I think that's a way to restore our democracy.
Well, and on that note, one of the sort of unintended consequences of the pandemic is that it may actually begin to push back in that direction, because one of the things that, what locates us often is our work. Mm-hmm. And if we're discovering that we can do work in all kinds of places and still be effective and productive, it may be that we get a kind of delocalization of work that actually leads to more vibrant small towns. Yep. I know
there's a whole bunch of Google and Facebook employees right now who are living in rural Montana and may stay there, forever.
And so even in my own family, I have one of my kids, for the course of the pandemic, moved out from San Francisco to a small college town, much like Gambier, but it is not Gambier. And so because she can do her work remotely, and so this may well be one of those things that leads to a new kind of what we call sort of how we think about work. I'd like to we're coming up on the end of our time, which is really sad for me, because this has been a great conversation to listen to. But to end us up, there are a couple of things that I'd like you guys to consider. One is that when we think about presidential elections, right? It's a choice between different futures, right? And so what are the first part of the question is, what's the choice between the different futures that we face in this election? And then the second part of the question really goes to, okay, on November 4th, or maybe it's November 11th or November 18th, or maybe sometime December 5th, right? At some point, we will have a winner. And the question is what do we do then? Right? So what's the election about? We will make our choice. what do we do then? What can, both parties do, to improve, sort of the democratic legitimacy, to re-strengthen democratic norms, to help us think about ourselves, Jeff, as you put it earlier in the evening, as an American people, not just simply people who are served by a president because they happen to vote for, in this case, him. Who would like to start?
I mean, I'm happy to start. Look, the one thing I would say is that if Joe Biden wins, this is gonna be an interesting in terms of what they do next. There's sort of two things I see as major opportunities that would not be particularly divisive. One is, despite the president of the United States claiming that it's barely happening and it's not a big deal, there is a pandemic. We're in the middle of a pandemic, and Joe Biden would probably spend the first 18 months of his presidency almost exclusively focused on trying to figure out how to deal with the pandemic, something that all Americans are currently dealing with. And so that gives him an opportunity to cut lots of deals with Republicans, to look for ways to work together for the American people that is not about the most contentious policy out there. The other thing is that I think there will be a real appetite post Donald Trump's defeat. I think we will have seen how our institutions have been strained. I think there will be sort of a post Watergate type desire for reform, anti-corruption reform. You can't install your kids in the White House. You can't have one of their spouses running the executive branch. A whole bunch of other things, not going to go through them all. But I think that there would be a decent amount of bipartisan support from people like Ben Sasse and other people who've put up anti-corruption legislation to try to come together and sort of figure some things out. One of the things, Joe Biden is famously popular in the Senate. He is friends with Mitch McConnell. These people can have conversations. I've never been a huge Joe Biden person or whatever. In fact, I've never cared that much about Joe Biden. There is something about this moment, the country feeling so broken, to have a person who has experienced tremendous loss, who has built great relationships with his colleagues, who has sort of been defined by being kind of decent and nice to people. And one of the reasons Bernie Sanders never went after him in their debates is because he said that Joe Biden was the only person that was nice to him in the Senate. Joe Biden, at a moment when we are fragile, psychologically fragile as a country, I think that Joe Biden has almost a crazy opportunity to be the person that does, just like after World War I, brings a return to normalcy.
All right. Richard?
Yeah. First thing I'll say is, again, I think it's likely Biden will win, but if he doesn't, there's going to be a huge shortage of grief counselors in New York City, Washington, D.C., and a bunch of other very liberal cities. And even the grief counselors may need grief counselors of their own. Maybe Canada's got some they can export to America if they let anybody pass the borders at this point. I think some of the comments that Sarah just made about Joe Biden may be true, maybe historically true. And the question is, who is Joe Biden right now? One of the real problems with this election is you have an election between a candidate who draws out much popular support and much loathing. And you have another candidate who spent the time in the basements who appears to be going through mental decline. And anyone who thinks this is a non-issue is kidding themselves. And if you have that kind of situation, the question is, who are you electing? This is a placeholder the Democrats have put up. It's the generic Democrat. They did not want Bernie Sanders to be the nominee because they thought he would more easily lose. Biden was an acceptable person. All the other candidates mysteriously dropped out quickly except Elizabeth Warren, so she could keep Sanders from winning a couple primaries, make it easier for Biden to consolidate support. The party's happy. They look like they're going to win the election. And then we'll find out what's behind the curtain. Who's really running the show, how strong the so-called moderates in the Democratic Party are to resisting the woke millions who are pushing the party to be something very different, pushing America to be something very different. And if you don't think that's a concern, you can say, okay, he's crazy. He's bringing up all these things that are not realistic. He's making apologies for Trump. That's not what I'm doing here. You don't know, and no one on this panel has any clue of what would happen if Biden wins, how long he can be president, who will really be calling the shots.
I just have to, Donald Trump's not the sharpest tool in the shed these days either. Not exactly somebody who's not Shakespeare here.
And for a guy who's been running his campaign from his basement, he's doing pretty well.
Yeah, he's great. Kicking.
Then he's run an incredibly error-free campaign from when they were at the very nadir to where they are now. So, I've been really, as a Democrat, very pleasantly surprised. I think 4 more years of Donald Trump, we just get the same thing, which is chaos and uncertainty. With Joe Biden, I think there's where Trump was the anti-Obama, Biden can be the anti-Trump in terms of returning normalcy. I think allowing Democrats and Republicans on the Hill to try to solve problems in a more traditional fashion, because he has those relationships. I don't think there'll be this attempt to try to undermine him like there was with Obama. Who knows? His hands are tied, like I said earlier, because of the budget. I think Sarah's exactly right. If he spends his first 18 months returning some competency to administrating what's happened with COVID, he will go a long way to cementing a Democratic majority for the next how many years, because that's really what what we need right now. And I think it's pretty easy to do that. And Trump had an opportunity to do that. He didn't do it. I think if he focuses on that, he's got a vice president who can be a competent administrator. The question will be, is he 4 years or 8 years? He's probably 4 years. And after 2 years, it'll be a jump ball again in the Democratic Party. But I think in the first 2 years, at least, he's going to have a lot of latitude. And the Democratic Party, even though they made a lot of compromises, that's a good thing. We compromised behind somebody who are willing to trust and we don't know exactly what it's going to play out in the next couple of years, but we trust him and we trust his instincts. We trust who he is because he's exuded some decency and competency.
All right, Jeff, I purposely left you for last because of all the panelists, you are the one who actually runs for office. And so I give you the last word.
Thank you. So I'm also the only legislator in Colorado with a Master's of Divinity degree. And the way I have experienced politics and really the way I experience life is that there's only ever the next pool of light. You never know what the pool of light, you don't know the full path. You just have to trust when you step into that next pool of light that a new pool of light will be illuminated for you. My wife calls it gathering the manna. You do what you're called to do every day and you trust that it's going to be enough. I have no idea what challenges Biden's going to face. I didn't know there was going to be a global pandemic. I didn't know murder hornets were going to be a thing. Who saw that as a subplot for 2020? There is no way to predict what is going to come in the first year, the first 2 years, the first 4 years. There's no way to predict what the election outcome is going to be during the midterms. It could be a huge wave in opposition to Biden. It could be a huge wave in support of his ability to take care of the pandemic. What I think you have is a choice between character. You've got two people who have, I think, made it really clear exactly who they are. And when someone shows you their character, you should believe them. And that is, I think, what's at stake in this election. And I certainly know what character I'm looking for in my president. And so we'll see what happens over these next 4 years.
All right. Well, with that, I would like to thank you guys. Richard, Sarah, Jeff, Paul. I think it's been a fantastic conversation. There's actually, and as you know, I have a lot more that I would gladly talk with you about because I think this is something that could occupy us for quite some time. I also want to convey that a lot of comments have come in on the chat thanking you for the professional job that you guys have done in taking a highly controversial and provocative topic where we are as a country today and dealing with it in a illuminating and professional fashion. And so I think that you've set a high bar for what Kenyon can accomplish when we seek to discuss contentious things. And so thank you so much on behalf of the Center for the Study of American Democracy, on behalf for the audience, which we unfortunately cannot see. So thank you. Before we close this evening, I would just like to make a couple of announcements. The first announcement is, and the brief discussion of the Supreme Court reminded me of this. One of the things that the CSAT is doing in conjunction with Gun Gallery is we're putting together a moderated list of political films that speak to our current political moment and some of the controversies which we are engaging with. And we think that film is important because it's one of the primary ways in which we discuss politics and culture, right? It comes out in film. And what sparked this in my mind was, I don't know if you guys remember The West Wing, but there was one of the episodes in The West Wing, and it wasn't one that I suggested, so I might get the episode wrong, where President Bartlett nominated 2 Supreme Court justices, one from either side of the aisle, because he thought it very important that you have sharp minds who disagreed, but disagreed respectfully on the bench, because that is what produces sound decisions that then are sustainable and will be sustained. And so the Gun Gallery is putting that together in conjunction with the CSAT, and so we'll have information for that. So if people want to go look and see what kind of films that people are suggesting and why they might be important. The other thing that I would like to announce is that next Tuesday we'll be having the second panel in the series, Race, Identity, and Contesting the Real America. It will take place as this panel Tuesday night, 7 p.m. It'll last again about 90 minutes, and it should be a very interesting discussion. And again, it's a controversial and contentious issue, which is really important for us to understand. And then we'll be continuing throughout October, all the way up to the election. And as Sean Decatur said, we will also then have a post-election panel to wrap up and say, hey, here's where we've come as a country, and here are some of the things that we might still face in the times ahead. With that, I would like to bring things to a close and thank everyone for spending their time with us this evening, and hopefully enjoy a good presidential debate. Thank you and good evening.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hey guys, you guys were fantastic.